We now begin the final oracle of Zechariah. We'll be looking at slides 104 through 119, and we'll be examining chapters 12, 13, and 14 in the book of Zechariah. This second oracle of Zechariah, in many ways, has similar themes to the previous oracle. There certainly is the theme of war. There's certainly the theme of the restoration of the people of God after their victory. But there are some differences as well. Whereas the initial of these last two oracles particularly focuses on the area of Palestine and Syria, the second one focuses primarily upon Jerusalem and Judah, so it's a little more specific. It does, in fact, begin with the same preface word that you find in the oracle that starts in chapter 9, which is the Hebrew word masah, or burden, which again sometimes is translated oracle. But this burden, this heavy message that the prophet is delivering, is a message that will figure into the future of the people of Israel. And another difference is that whereas the previous oracle was largely in poetry but ends in prose, this oracle is almost entirely in prose, other than the short section in chapter 13, often called the Song of the Sword, which is just a short poetic interjection. The main focus of this final oracle in Zechariah, as I mentioned, is the city of Jerusalem. So with that in mind, go, if you will, to slide 105, and we will begin looking at the various parts of this oracle. The first 9 verses of chapter 12 describe war and victory, but this is an international war. In the previous oracle, if you go back to chapter 9, the oracle begins in Syria, Hadrach, Damascus, Tyre, Sidon, on down to Gaza, Ekron, Ashkelon in the Philistine country. The oracle that begins in chapter 12 immediately describes the nations of the world. This is the word of Yahweh concerning Israel, who stretches out the heavens. I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling, and on that day all the nations of the earth are gathered against her. And I'll make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. There are 2 metaphors that are used of the city of Jerusalem in this initial part of the passage. One is that Jerusalem is an intoxicating cup of wine in verse 2. I'll make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding nations reeling. This metaphor describes Jerusalem as though it were a cup of wine that makes the nations drunk as they try to annex Jerusalem. The second is the metaphor of an immovable rock that lacerates anyone that tries to dislodge it. Anyone who tries to move this rock will injure themselves. And so even though the nations of the earth are gathered against Jerusalem, they will not be able to move this city. This city, in fact, will be protected by the watchful eye of God, who watches over the house of Judah. And on that day, when they attempt to invade, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness. And the leaders of Judah will say in their hearts, the people of Jerusalem are strong because Yahweh Sabaoth is their God. Under Yahweh's watchful eye, then, Judah's leaders will be like a consuming fire to their enemies. God will fight on the side of his people, and in fact, the weakest among them will be as strong as David, and the house of David will be like the heavenly man of war, the angel of the Lord, the Malach Yahweh. And so it says in verse 7, Yahweh will save the dwellings of Judah first, so that the honor of the house of David and of Jerusalem's inhabitants may not be greater than that of Judah. In other words, the glory of the people of Judah and the glory of the house of David will be equalized. They will be treated in the same way, not one above the other. And on that day, Yahweh will shield those who live in Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the Malach Yahweh going before them. On that day, I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. As you move to the next part of this oracle, slide 106, there is the description of a pierced one. It begins with a statement, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication, and they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and bitterly grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. On that day the weeping in Jerusalem will be great, like the weeping of Hadon-Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. Now, this is a very interesting text for several reasons. First of all, there are textual variations in this passage, both from Hebrew sources as well as Greek sources. First of all, the source that I have read, and I've read to you from the New International Version, is that they will look on me, whom they have pierced. This is the way it reads in the Masoretic text of the Hebrews. This is the standard Hebrew text that is used for most Old Testament translation. And in agreement with that statement, they will look on me, whom they've pierced, is the Qumran scroll that has the text of Zechariah in it. This is 4Q12C. This Qumran document is 1,000 years older than our Masoretic text, because the Qumran text goes all the way before the time of Jesus. But it also uses that first-person pronoun, me. They will look on me, whom they have pierced. A number of English versions follow this reading. The International Version, which I just read from, but also the New American Standard Bible, the New English Bible, the English Standard Version, the American Standard Version, and the older King James Version. All of them follow this reading. They will look on me, whom they have pierced. However, there are other Hebrew manuscripts that use a third-person pronoun. They will look on him, whom they have pierced. And this reading is followed in the Revised Standard Version, the New American Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, the Contemporary English Version, and the Jerusalem Bible, among others. So the difference between me and him is essentially this. If you translate it as me, then the object in view is Yahweh himself, because it is the Lord who is mentioned in the first person in the beginning of verse 10. I will pour out on the house of David, and they will look on me. On the other hand, if the Hebrew reading is followed, they will look on him whom they have pierced, there seems to be a little bit of distance between Yahweh and the person who is pierced, even though that person would be very close to Yahweh. Then there's actually a different reading in the Septuagint. The Greek translation of the Old Testament by the Jews, roughly 2 centuries or so before the time of Jesus, says they will turn towards me because they have insulted me. So this is quite a different reading. Now, however one resolves the textual issue here, John certainly understands the passage to refer to Christ in the New Testament, in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 19, because he links this phrase, they will look on the one they've pierced, or they will look on me whom they've pierced. He quotes that and links it back to the Book of Zechariah. So John certainly understands this to refer to Christ. So whether it's translated as me or it's translated as him, the fact remains that in the New Testament it seems to clearly refer to Christ. Slide 107. There is another issue, though, connected with this that we need to explore that also is related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were fragments of a scroll that since has been labeled 4Q285, and in the fragments of this scroll, there seemed to be a reference to a pierced Messiah. And in fact, this fragment made international headlines in 1991, which is, by the time I'm lecturing here, is nearly 20 years ago. But the international hubbub about this passage was that it was read by 2 scholars as referring to a pierced Messiah. And if this Qumran scroll did in fact refer to a pierced Messiah, it would be linked to this passage in Zechariah. Now, 4Q285 is not a text of the book of Zechariah. You should understand that. It is a Qumran text about the theology of Qumran. But nonetheless, in the unpointed text, the Hebrew letters are capable of two different renderings. Either an enemy will put the Messiah to death, or the Messiah will have the enemy leader put to death. Part of the problem is that this is a fragmented scroll, and so we have a number of the words on the pieces of the fragments, as you can see in the photograph of the Pierced Messiah text. But at the same time, we have gaps where parts of the manuscript have deteriorated altogether, and so we don't know what they say in the middle. So it leaves us with some ambiguity about how to read this text. If the first option is correct, it would be a striking parallel with the death of Jesus. And in fact, those scholars who read this as a Pierced Messiah text often read it as though it were a text that should be linked to the death of Jesus. Most scholars, on the other hand, believe that the best reading is the second reading, that it isn't the enemy who puts the Messiah to death, but it's the Messiah who puts the enemy to death. In any case, this issue has not entirely been resolved, and there are scholars on both sides of the issue. But it is a text that you will hear from time to time in connection with this passage in Zechariah 12. And so I was bound to mention it simply because it's part of the larger discussion of the passage in Zechariah that talks about the pierced one for whom people will mourn. Now, the last verses of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13 is going to talk about the mourning of people, the grieving of people for this pierced one. The people's grieving would be so intense that it would be comparable to grief for the death of a firstborn son, or even comparable to the wailing in the pagan ritual mourning for the fertility deities. Now, when it talks about the grief that one might have for a firstborn son, I think that's pretty understandable to all of us as a very intense kind of grieving. But the weeping of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo may be something that doesn't immediately make sense to you. So I need to explain that. In Canaanite fertility religion, and Mesopotamian religion in general, there was the very frequent idea of a deity who each fall in the dry season descended into the underworld, or in essence died until the spring. One of those was Tammuz, one of those was Baal. You find different references to deities who do this. But the weeping of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo is a ritual weeping in the fall that was carried on in the mythology of Canaanite culture. And this weeping was for the deity that now descends into the underworld and results in the dryness of the land during the dry season of the year. Since the deity was believed to be a fertility deity, the land would be dry during the time that this deity was in the underworld. This passage is in no way attempting to justify or give credit to this ritual mourning for a pagan deity, and it's not acknowledging the pagan deity as a real deity. But it is saying that those who are weeping for the pierced one will be as loud and as intense as those who wept for the pagan deity that descended into the underworld. And so it is basically a comparative statement of something that was very well known. Each Israelite clan would mourn separately, and especially there is a description of David and their wives and Nathan and their wives. Now you need to remember that David, of course, is the ideal king of Israel, and Nathan is one of his sons. So David and Nathan probably represents the royal side of the people of Judah. And then it mentions the house of Levi and their wives and the clan of Shammai and their wives. Shammai was one of the sons of Levi, and this would represent the priestly clans. Similar to some of the earlier oracles of Isaiah, where there is both a royal and a priestly line, this passage incorporates that same idea, that David and Nathan represent the royal line, and Levi and Shammai represent the priestly line. But each line, the royal line and the priestly line, would mourn separately for the one who was pierced. And then it says that on that day, the day of the piercing of this representative of Yahweh, a cleansing fountain for purification from sin would be opened to the family of David and to all Jerusalem. On that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. This reference is very similar to what we find earlier in the book of Zechariah, that the sin of the land will be cleansed in a single day. Slide 109. In the aftermath of this purification, all traces of idolatry will be removed from the land. Every vestige of false prophecy would be condemned, and this is what is described in verses 2 through 6. On that day, the Lord says, I will banish the names of the idols from the land, and they will be remembered no more, declares Yahweh Sabaoth. I will remove both the prophets and the spirit of impurity from the land. Now, back in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, the judgment which was to be executed upon a false prophet was death. If anyone spoke in the name of Yahweh, and that word was not a true word from Yahweh, that false prophet was to be executed. This passage then talks about that very thing. It says, if anyone still prophesies, his father and mother to whom he was born will say to him, you must die, because you've told lies in Yahweh's name. And when he prophesies, his own parents will stab him. In other words, there would be such an intense devotion to the Torah, such an intense commitment to follow the ways of the Lord, that parents would not even hesitate to execute their own children if their own children turned out to be false prophets. So this is very much like the passage that you find earlier in Zechariah about swearing falsely in the name of the Lord, or speaking in the name of the Lord in a way that is inappropriate, to misuse the name of the Lord. In fact, so dangerous would it be to be a false prophet in those days of intense commitment to the Torah that the traditional clothing of the prophet would be discarded. Going all the way back to Elijah the prophet, who dressed in a garment of hair, as you discover in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, those who were false prophets would not try to deceive people by taking on the traditional garment of the prophet. Apparently, what had often happened is that people who wanted to be recognized as prophets would adopt the clothing, the ancient clothing of Elijah and Elisha, in order to be recognized as prophets, even though they weren't genuine prophets. This would happen no more. In fact, they would not put on a prophet's garment of hair in order to deceive. And if someone suspected them of even being a prophet, they would say, I'm not a prophet, I'm a farmer. I've been a farmer since I was a kid. I've been on the land since my youth. And if someone asks, what are these wounds on your body? He would say, this is just simply things that I received in a scuffle with friends. Now, the wounds on the body may be somewhat ambiguous to most readers, but you do need to know that in the ancient Near East, prophets were widely known, not only in Israel, but in all of the other countries as well. In fact, we have quite a number of texts that tell us about the use of prophecy in nations other than Israel. One of the things that was typical in prophetic movements, especially outside of Israel, was that prophets, particularly pagan prophets, would indulge in self-infliction of wounds as well as some kind of ecstasy in giving their messages. You find hints of that in the story between Elijah and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. I think it's 1 Kings 18 or 19, right along in there, where the false prophets of Baal cut themselves as they tried to gain the attention of Baal. So this passage about the wounds on your body is probably referring to self-inflicted wounds in a prophetic ecstasy. But if anyone would suspect these people of being prophets because they saw what appeared to be the wounds of self-infliction, which would be typical of pagan prophecy, they would simply deny it and say, these are not signs that I'm a prophet. These are just wounds that I had in a scuffle with my friends. Now, some people have taken chapter 13 and verse 6, which talks about wounds on your body, as referring to the wounds of the Messiah, such as in the New Testament. At first glance, that might seem to be possible, but in the larger context of this passage, that is not a very likely interpretation. It would not make sense if the wounds on the body were the wounds of Christ, to say this was wounds given in the house of my friends, as an excuse for not being a prophet. So it's better probably to interpret this passage not as a messianic reference to the death of Jesus, but rather to the fact that people will be disclaiming prophethood because there was so much false prophecy, and they would be relying entirely upon prophecy from the standpoint of the Torah, that only true prophets would be recognized. Verses 7 through 9 is called the Song of the Sword. This is the only poetic section in this last oracle. This resumes the theme of the shepherd that we saw in the first oracle, because the first lines say, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me, declares Yahweh Sabaoth. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." Now, the good shepherd in this passage is the one who stands close to Yahweh, or stands as Yahweh's associate. In spite of that, the sword of execution is called forth, and the sword is called to be raised against Yahweh's shepherd. And the good shepherd will be struck down, and the flock, in fact, would scatter. Most of the flock would perish, because it says the hand of judgment will be turned against the little ones, and in the whole land, declares Yahweh, 2/3 will be struck down and perish, and only 1/3 will be left. And that third will be put into the fires of refinement, tested like silver and gold, until they call upon my name, and I will answer them. But in the end, this remnant, this third that is left over, would become the covenant people of God. And the final words of chapter 13, "They are my people," and they will say, "Yahweh is our God." This is the basic formula for the covenant. This is the basic formula for the relationship between God and his people. He is their God. They are his people. And this is the result of the death of the shepherd. As we go to chapter 14, we need to spend just a moment talking about the first phrase, because it uses a phrase that is very familiar in the Old Testament prophets. This phrase, the day of the Lord, or the day of Yahweh. Slide 111. The language, the day of Yahweh, begins all the way back in the 8th century before Christ, in the time of Amos. In Amos' oracles, it's also in the oracles of Isaiah. It's also in several other prophets of the Old Testament. And the term day of Yahweh, or day of the Lord, is a term that essentially refers to doomsday, a day of judgment. In fact, in the book of Amos, Amos says, "Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord." Some people apparently thought the day of the Lord was simply a day of victory and triumph for God's people. Well, it might be that in one sense, but it was also a day of judgment. And so, woe to you who long for the day of the Lord, Amos says. It'll be a dark day. It will be like a man fleeing from a bear, and he gets home, leans up against the wall, and gets struck by a poisonous viper. It'll be a terrible day, a day of judgment. Other expressions also are used in connection with the day of the Lord in the Old Testament prophets. One is the Hebrew expression in days to come, in the last days, or the expression in that day. And all of these expressions are fluid to some degree and have a semantic range that includes both things that are very near in the historical future, as well as things that are a long ways away in the historical future. If you look at slide 112, I've given you a brief list of both the near kinds of references and the far kinds of references that attend this phrase as it is used in the earlier prophets. The earlier prophets spoke of the day of Yahweh as a day of judgment in history and in the near future. The day's coming quickly, one of the prophets says. Essentially, this meant the judgment of exile, which was leveled against the northern nation when Assyria took the northern nation into exile, and the nation of Judah, the southern nation, when Babylon took it into exile. For them, this was the day of the Lord. There were judgments in history as well upon the nations that surrounded Israel and Judah. The day of the Lord. But associated with these predictions of exile and war and judgment in the near future was language that seems to reach far beyond simply what was going to happen in the next few years. Some of the depictions of the day of the Lord describe judgment upon the whole world by universal cataclysm. The universe will disintegrate, the sun and moon will be darkened, and the stars will fall. The celestial bodies will collapse. The earth will reel like a drunken man. Yet in the midst of this incredible future, God's people will be saved, and they will come out victorious in the end. And finally, there will be universal peace among the nations. All of these are envisioned as part of this term Day of the Lord, or Day of Yahweh. So this is why I say that this expression has somewhat of a fluid meaning in the prophets, sometimes referring to the near future, sometimes referring to the far future. Now it is this very expression that begins chapter 14 in this final oracle of Zechariah. A day of the Lord is coming. A day of Yahweh is coming, when your plunder will be divided among you, and I'll gather the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. So in this vision of war and victory, and we move now to slide 113, there is described a battle for the city of Jerusalem, which is to be on the day of the Lord. All of the nations will put the city of Jerusalem to siege, and during that siege they will commit all of the atrocities that are accustomed to be thought of in connection with war. They will fight against the city will be captured, the houses will be looted and ransacked, women will be raped, half of the city will go into exile, but some of the people will not die, but they will be left in the city. But then in the midst of this, God himself will go out and fight against the nations who have come to fight against Jerusalem. Yahweh will intervene to save the city, and he will appear in the Mount of Olives with his angels, his angelic hosts, and his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. The mountain will split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, half of the mountain going to the north, half to the south. And this great valley will be opened up between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. You will flee by my mountain valley, for it will extend to Azel, and you will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah the king of Judah. And then Yahweh my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. This intervention of God, this theophany of God on the Mount of Olives, will result in very unusual conditions. In that day there will be no light or cold or frost. It will be a unique day without daytime or nighttime, a day known only to the Lord. When evening comes, there will be light. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half to the eastern sea and half to the western sea, in summer and in winter. This refers probably to the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, as you know, is not a living body of water because there is no outlet. The Jordan River flows into the northern end of the Dead Sea, but there is no outlet. And in fact, the concentration of minerals and chemicals in the Dead Sea is so strong that normal aquatic life cannot live there. Now, however, there will be a great valley opened up between the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea so that the Dead Sea will no longer be dead. And the waters of the Mediterranean will flow all the way to the Dead Sea, giving it the power of life. And in that day, Jerusalem will be secure forever, and the enemies of Jerusalem will be destroyed. The terrain and the seasons will be affected. It will not be night and day. There will just be a daytime, and in the evening it'll be light as though it were daytime. The Lord will be king over the whole earth on that day, verse 9. That day there will be one Yahweh, and his name, the only name. And the whole land, from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, will become like the Arabah, which is the Jordan Trench, actually. But Jerusalem will be raised up and remain in its place, from the Benjamin gate to the side of the first gate to the corner gate, and from the Tower of Hananel to royal wine presses. It'll be inhabited. And never again will Jerusalem be destroyed. Jerusalem will be secure. All of this is associated then with the coming of the Lord as the king over the world. He is going to appear in Jerusalem, and he will be king over the whole world. Slide 114. Survivors from the nations will come to Jerusalem in that time to worship Yahweh Sabaoth and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, which is called Sukkot in Hebrew. And during that time, every item in the city will be considered as holy. The enemies of Jerusalem will have been destroyed. In fact, in verse 12, the Lord will strike those nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they're standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. And that day men will be stricken by the Lord with great panic. But the survivors of all of those nations will then be called upon to worship Yahweh in Jerusalem. No longer will there be any distinction between the holy and the profane, because everything in the whole city will be holy. There won't be things that are holy and things that are unholy. Everything will be holy. From the bells on the horses to the pots that are used for cooking, everything will be holy. In fact, as it says in verse 20, on that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses. Now that's something that normally would be inscribed upon vessels that are only used in the temple. But even the bells on horses will be inscribed holy to the Lord. And the cooking pots in Yahweh's house will be like sacred bowls in front of the altar. Every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to Yahweh Sabaoth. And all who come to sacrifice will take some of the pots and cook in them. In fact, all dishonest merchants will be banned from the temple. The term that is used here refers to racketeers. It's the term Hakana'ani, which is the term for Canaanite, but it is used as a euphemism for racketeers, which is not only true in Hebrew, but true in some of the other cognate languages with Hebrew. So when it says in the last verse of Zechariah that on that day there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of Yahweh Sabaoth, it means there will no longer be any dishonest racketeers in the temple, people who are deceiving others for the sake of money. And thus we come to the end of this last oracle in Zechariah. Slide 115. Well, how to interpret this last oracle? Once again, these are some of the most difficult passages in the Old Testament to interpret. When it comes to something like the Song of the Sword, for instance, a historical interpretation that tries to put it in the context of the Old Testament will put it in the past, earlier than the time of the exile. And in this case, then, the attack upon the shepherd would probably refer to the downfall of the dynasty of David. The scattering of the flock eventually would be the exile of Israel and Judah to Assyria and Babylon. On the other hand, if one takes a very futuristic interpretation, particularly because of the passages that seem to refer to the time of Christ, then the shepherd is Christ himself, the Messiah, and the scattering is the flight of the disciples on the night of Jesus' betrayal. So there are widely different interpretations to this passage. What I want to emphasize is that at least at 2 points, there are New Testament passages that clearly are linked to this oracle in Zechariah. One is the pierced one. John's Gospel links the pierced one to the soldier's action in piercing Jesus when he was on the cross. And John says this was a fulfillment of what was said in Zechariah. And similar to that, in the book of Revelation, there is a description of all the peoples on the earth mourning because of the one who was pierced. And again, that is obviously a reference right back to this passage in Zechariah chapter 12. The other link to the New Testament has to do with the shepherd who was struck down. It is Jesus himself who quoted the Song of the Sword with reference to himself and said the shepherd would be struck and the sheep would be scattered. Jesus obviously is referring to his arrest and betrayal on the night in which he was given over to suffering and death, and the fleeing of the disciples at that. Now, the striking down of the flock, if you take it in this futuristic sense, might refer to the Jewish people who were so devastated in the first and the second Jewish revolts. At that time, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jews were scattered throughout the world, even more than they were scattered already. And some have even taken it in a Christian sense, that it might refer to the persecution of Christians in the apostolic era, particularly after the reigns of Nero, Titus Vespasian, and eventually Domitian. But however it is taken, there are at least two links in this oracle with the New Testament, and those should not be missed. Slide 117. It's fair to say that the visions in this second oracle are very much at home in the environment of Jewish apocalyptic. It's very stylistic, it's very symbolic. Those who embrace dispensationalism tend to see this oracle as pointing toward the end of the age. And so if you read dispensational writers, they will often refer this to the period of the Great Tribulation. Writers such as the notes you find in the Scofield Reference Bible, for instance, or the notes of Charles Ryrie in the Ryrie Study Bible. So they will connect this second oracle with the Great Tribulation and the second coming of Christ, and eventually the millennial kingdom to follow. They will interpret the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, to refer to the millennial kingdom, the 1,000 years of peace, described in the book of Revelation. Amillennial interpreters, on the other hand, tend to see this oracle as pointing toward a spiritual fulfillment in the church. Here, the real issue is not Jerusalem physically, or the people of Israel physically, but has to do with the church, which is spiritual Jerusalem, so to speak, and the people of God, which is spiritual Israel. Others see that perhaps there is a double meaning, a double entendre, that has both a literal fulfillment historically, which would account for the references in the New Testament to this oracle with respect to the death of Jesus, but possibly also a spiritual meaning that goes all the way to the eschatological future and the end of the age. Those, again, are open questions that sincere Christians discuss with each other and, in some cases, debate. But my emphasis is that we should be clear about what the Bible is clear, and the things that are more ambiguous we can afford to leave open, even though they are discussed. There are some other possible eschatological implications in this passage. The wars that are described in Zechariah 14, for instance, are very much like the description of the battle of the great day of God Almighty in the book of Revelation. The fountain of blessing in Jerusalem and the rise of the family of David sounds very messianic in some sense. Certainly this seems to have some meaning in terms of the atonement death of Jesus and the fact that Jesus was the son of David. The establishment of God's kingdom over the whole world, very similar to the kinds of visions you have in the New Testament of the kingdoms of the world becoming the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and even of Jesus' prayer that God's will and kingdom would come. His will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. And in fact, the last two chapters of the New Testament describe the descent of the New Jerusalem, the city of God that is holy and protected forever. At the same time, we must also remember that in the time of Zechariah, and indeed in the Old Testament in general, there is no distinction between what Christians understand as the first coming of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus. In the Old Testament, we simply have the coming of the Messiah, and there is no distinction between a first coming and a second coming. Indeed, it is Jesus himself who tells us that there should be a division when he himself talks about the fact that he will come again. And finally, at the ascension of Jesus, the angel says to the disciples, the same Jesus you saw go into heaven will come again as you have seen him leave. So, if this vision in the last oracle of Zechariah concerns the Messiah, it then collapses both the first and the second advent together and does not distinguish between them. At this point, that is about the best we can do with this imagery. We have some things that we can clearly state. We have a number of things that we must leave somewhat open. And my advice is that we, as Christian interpreters, do not try to be more specific than is allowable by a proper interpretation of Scripture. So the ambiguities that are there may be intentional ambiguities. They may be there intentionally to help us understand that God is in control of the future, even though we may not know how all of the details of that future will work out. This, then, brings us to the end of our lectures on Zechariah.